The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Millfield as Augustus Gus Thornfield stepped out of his polished black Cadillac, adjusting his expensive Stetson with the smugness of a man who owned half the county. At 62, Gus was everything money could buy and arrogance could amplify. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair slicked back and a mustache waxed to perfection. His hand-tooled leather boots had never known a day of honest work, and his custom-made suit probably cost more than most families in Millfield made in 6 months. The Thornfield Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of prime Texas cattle country, a testament to generations of wealth built on the backs of others. Gus's great-grandfather had claimed the land during the cattle boom of the 1880s, and every Thornfield since had added to the empire through shrewd business deals, strategic marriages, and an utter lack of conscience when it came to crushing anyone who stood in their way. Today, Gus had come to town for his monthly ritual, holding court at Murphy's feed store, where local ranchers and farmhands gathered to discuss cattle prices, weather patterns, and the general state of their hardscrabble lives. For Gus, these visits weren't about business. They were about reminding everyone in Millfield exactly who held the power in their small corner of the world. The feed store was already crowded when Gus pushed through the screen door, the rusty hinges announcing his arrival with a prolonged squeal. Conversations died mid-sentence as heads turned toward the imposing figure, some nodding respectfully, others merely averting their eyes. Old Murphy himself, a weathered man of 70 with hands like cracked leather, looked up from his ledger with barely concealed distaste. "Afternoon, Gus," Murphy said, his tone neutral, but his eyes cold. "What brings you to our humble establishment?" Gus's laugh was like gravel in a cement mixer. "Just checking in on my neighbors, Murphy, making sure everyone's getting by." His gaze swept the store, taking inventory of the worn clothes, calloused hands, and resigned expressions of men who worked twice as hard as him for a tenth of his wealth. In the back corner of the store, partially hidden behind a display of horse tackle, stood 16-year-old Caleb Rivers. The boy was thin as a fence post, all knees and elbows with sun-bleached hair that stuck up at odd angles despite his attempts to smooth it down. His clothes were clean but patched, his boots held together with duct tape and determination. Caleb's father had died in a trucking accident 3 years ago, leaving him to care for his ailing mother and their struggling 40-acre farm on the outskirts of town. Caleb had come to Murphy's to buy feed on credit, hoping the old man would extend his already strained account for another month. The boy worked every odd job he could find, cleaning stalls, mending fences, hauling hay, but it was never enough. The bank was threatening foreclosure, and Caleb knew that without a miracle, they'd lose everything by Christmas. "Speaking of neighbors," Gus continued, his voice carrying easily through the store, "I heard young Rivers here is having some financial difficulties." All eyes turned to Caleb, who felt his face burn with shame and anger. Shame to see a family farm go under, but that's the way of things, I suppose. Some folks are born to succeed, others... He shrugged with exaggerated sympathy. Caleb stepped forward, his jaw clenched tight. "We're managing just fine, Mr. Thornfield," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Gus's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Oh, are you now? That's interesting, because I heard the bank's ready to foreclose on your place. 40 acres of good grazing land, going to waste because a boy thinks he can do a man's work." The silence in the store was deafening. Every man there had struggled with drought, debt, and disappointment, but few had been subjected to such public humiliation. Murphy cleared his throat uncomfortably but said nothing. "In Millfield, you didn't cross Gus Thornfield unless you were prepared for the consequences." "Matter of fact," Gus continued, warming to his audience, "I've been thinking about making an offer on your place, boy. Save you the embarrassment of losing it to the bank. I'd be willing to pay, let's say half what it's worth. Consider it a mercy purchase." Caleb's hands balled into fists at his sides. 3 years of backbreaking labor, of watching his mother grow weaker while he struggled to keep their heads above water, of being treated like a charity case by men who had inherited their success instead of earning it. Something inside him snapped. "I wouldn't sell you a shovel full of dirt if my life depended on it," Caleb said, his voice carrying a strength that surprised even him. Gus's face flushed red above his perfect mustache. He wasn't accustomed to being defied, especially not by a 16-year-old in patched jeans and taped-up boots. "Careful, boy," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're talking to a man who could buy and sell you 10 times over." "Money doesn't make you a man, Mr. Thornfield," Caleb replied, meeting Gus's glare without flinching. "It just makes you rich." The tension in the store was thick enough to cut with a knife. Several men shifted uncomfortably, knowing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Old Murphy watched from behind his counter, his ancient eyes gleaming with something that might have been approval. Gus stepped closer to Caleb, using his size to intimidate. "You think you're clever, don't you, boy? Think you can smart-mouth your betters and walk away?" He glanced around the store, making sure he had everyone's attention. "Tell you what, Rivers, since you're so full of pride and poor judgment, let me make you a proposition." Caleb said nothing, but his green eyes never wavered from Gus's face. "I've got a bull on my ranch," Gus continued, his voice taking on the tone of a showman. "Name's Iron Thunder. Meanest, orneriest piece of beef you've ever seen. 2,000 pounds of pure hatred wrapped in black hide. I bought him from a bankrupt outfit up in Oklahoma, thinking I could use him for breeding, but the damned animal won't let anyone within 50 feet of him." The men in the store began to murmur among themselves. Everyone in the county had heard whispers about Thornfield's impossible bull, the animal that had hospitalized 3 ranch hands and destroyed more fencing than a tornado. 37 men have tried to handle that bull," Gus said, his voice rising with dramatic flair. "Professional cowboys, rodeo riders, even a so-called bull whisperer from Montana. Every single one of them ended up running for their lives or getting carried out on a stretcher." Caleb remained silent, sensing a trap, but unable to see its shape. Gus's smile was predatory as he delivered his ultimatum. "Here's my proposition, boy. You seem to think you're man enough to go toe-to-toe with Augustus Thornfield, so prove it. Come to my ranch and touch that bull. Not ride him, not rope him, just walk up and lay one finger on his hide. Do that, and I'll give you my entire ranch, all 12,000 acres, the house, the cattle, everything." The store erupted in gasps and incredulous murmurs. Several men laughed outright, thinking Gus had finally lost his mind. 12,000 acres was worth millions of dollars, more money than most of them would see in 10 lifetimes. "But when you can't do it," Gus continued, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade, "when you run away with your tail between your legs like every other man who's faced Iron Thunder, you sign over your pathetic little 40 acres to me. No money, no negotiations, just your mark on a piece of paper." The store fell silent again as the full implications of the wager sank in. Gus was essentially offering to trade his empire for a failing farm, knowing full well that no one could touch his demon bull. It was the kind of arrogant gamble that only a man drunk on his own power would make. Old Murphy spoke up from behind the counter, his voice cracked with age but sharp with intelligence. "That's quite a wager, Gus. You sure you want to bet your life's work on the temperament of a bull?" Gus waved dismissively. "I'm not worried, Murphy. The boy's got more pride than sense, but he's not stupid enough to take a bet he can't win." All eyes turned to Caleb, who stood frozen in the center of the store. The smart thing to do was walk away, let Gus have his moment of triumph, and hope that humiliation might be enough to satisfy the man's ego. But as Caleb looked around at the faces surrounding him, some sympathetic, some pitying, all of them certain he would back down, he thought about his mother, lying in her hospital bed 60 miles away, fighting an infection that might kill her if they couldn't afford the medication she needed. He thought about the foreclosure notice tucked in his back pocket, about the empty refrigerator at home, about the way Gus Thornfield looked at him like he was something to be scraped off the bottom of a boot. Most of all, he thought about his father, who had always told him that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he owned, but by what he was willing to sacrifice for the people he loved. Caleb took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and looked Gus Thornfield directly in the eye. "I accept," he said, his voice steady as granite. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the flies seemed to stop buzzing. Gus's confident smile faltered for just a moment before returning with twice the intensity. "Well, well," he said, clapping his hands together with false joviality. "Looks like we've got ourselves a genuine hero, boys. David taking on Goliath, right here in Murphy's feed store. He pulled out his cell phone and made a show of checking his calendar. How's tomorrow afternoon sound, Rivers? Say 2 o'clock? That'll give you time to get your affairs in order and maybe write a farewell letter to your mama. Caleb nodded once. 2 o'clock. Gus's grin was savage as he headed for the door. Don't be late, boy. Iron Thunder doesn't like to be kept waiting. As the Cadillac's engine roared to life outside, the men in the store began talking all at once, their voices a mixture of admiration, concern, and disbelief. Old Murphy walked over to Caleb, placing a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. Son, he said quietly, I've known Gus Thornfield for 40 years, and I've never seen him make a bet he wasn't sure he could win. That bull of his, there are stories. Caleb met the old man's concerned gaze. What kind of stories? Murphy's eyes were grave as he answered. The kind that end with funerals, boy. The kind that end with funerals. Word of the impossible wager spread through Millfield like wildfire in August. By morning, every coffee shop, diner, and front porch buzzed with debate about whether young Caleb Rivers had lost his mind or found his calling. The smart money was on the former. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's only physician, and one of the few men who'd seen Iron Thunder up close, shook his head grimly as he discussed the situation with Sheriff Tom Bradley over breakfast at Mabel's diner. That bull isn't just mean, Tom, Dr. Hayes said, stirring his coffee with deliberate slowness. He's calculating. I was there when Thornfield first brought him in, thought I might need to tranquilize him for transport. The moment I stepped into that trailer, Iron Thunder looked at me like he was measuring my funeral suit. Sheriff Bradley, a compact man with steel gray hair and 30 years of law enforcement experience, had his own concerns. I've written 3 incident reports involving that animal. First was Jake Morrison, concussion and 4 broken ribs when Thunder charged the fence just because Jake walked too close. Second was that rodeo rider from Fort Worth ended up with a punctured lung. Third, he paused, his expression darkening. Third was Thornfield's own nephew visiting from Dallas. Kid thought he could impress his girlfriend by getting close to the bull. Spent 2 weeks in intensive care. Meanwhile, at the Rivers farm, Caleb sat beside his mother's hospital bed, holding her frail hand while she slept. Margaret Rivers had been battling pneumonia for 3 weeks, her condition worsening because they couldn't afford the specialized antibiotics she needed. The doctors had been kind, but clear. Without proper treatment, she might not survive another month. When Margaret woke, her eyes found Caleb's face with the sharp intelligence that illness hadn't dimmed. You look troubled, son. More than usual. Caleb hesitated, knowing his mother would try to talk him out of what he planned to do. But he'd never lied to her, and he wasn't about to start now. He told her about the confrontation at Murphy's store, about Gus Thornfield's humiliating offer, and about the wager that could save or destroy everything they had left. Margaret listened without interruption, her weathered fingers squeezing his hand when he finished. Oh, Caleb, she whispered, that man's pride will be the death of him, and he's trying to make it the death of you, too. I have to try, Mama, Caleb said quietly. If I win, we can pay for your medicine, save the farm, maybe even help some other folks Thornfield's been squeezing. If I lose, he shrugged with false bravado. We were going to lose everything anyway. Margaret studied her son's face, seeing in it the same stubborn determination that had driven his father to work double shifts to provide for his family. Your daddy always said that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. As afternoon approached, pickup trucks and cars began converging on the Thornfield ranch. Word had spread beyond Millfield, drawing curious spectators from 3 counties. Some came to witness what they expected would be a spectacular failure. Others hoped to see Gus Thornfield finally get his comeuppance, even if it meant watching a boy get hurt in the process. The Thornfield ranch was a monument to wealth and intimidation. The main house was a sprawling mansion of red brick and white columns, surrounded by manicured lawns that required a full-time crew to maintain. The barns were immaculate, the fences painted to perfection, the equipment newer and shinier than anything most visitors had ever seen. But it was the pen at the back of the property that drew everyone's attention. A reinforced steel enclosure that looked more like a prison than a pasture. The bars were 2 inches thick, The posts sunk 8 feet deep in concrete. Scratches and dents in the metal told the story of countless failed attempts to contain what lived inside. At exactly 2 o'clock, Gus Thornfield emerged from his house wearing his finest suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Behind him walked a man in expensive boots and a lawyer's confidence. Harrison Webb, Thornfield's attorney, carrying a leather briefcase containing the papers that would transfer ownership of the Rivers farm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gus announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying easily across the yard, "thank you for coming to witness this historic moment. In just a few minutes, young Mr. Rivers will attempt something that 37 grown men couldn't accomplish." As if summoned by his words, Caleb's battered pickup truck rattled up the drive, backfiring once before shuddering to a stop. The boy who climbed out looked impossibly young among the weathered ranchers and curious townspeople, but there was something in his posture, a quiet determination that made several observers exchange surprised glances. Old Murphy had driven out to support the boy, as had Sheriff Bradley, Dr. Hayes, and a handful of others who'd known Caleb's father. They formed a small cluster of moral support in a sea of skeptical faces. "Well, Rivers," Gus called out, his voice dripping with false bonhomie, "ready to make history? Or would you prefer to sign those papers now and save us all some time?" Caleb ignored the laughter from some of the crowd and walked steadily toward the steel pen. As he approached, a sound rose from within that made every person present take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't quite a bellow, wasn't quite a roar. It was something deeper, more primal, the sound of barely contained fury given voice. The ground seemed to vibrate with each thunderous breath, and several people in the crowd began muttering prayers under their breath. Then iron thunder appeared, and Caleb understood why grown men had run in terror. The bull was massive beyond imagination, easily 2,000 pounds of muscle and malice. His hide was midnight black, so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His horns were short, but wickedly curved, designed by nature for maximum damage. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled. Intelligent, calculating, filled with a hatred that seemed almost human in its intensity. Thunder had heard the crowd gathering and positioned himself in the center of his pen, head lowered, muscles coiled like springs. Steam rose from his nostrils in the afternoon heat, and his tail lashed back and forth with mechanical precision. When his gaze fixed on Caleb, the boy felt as if he were being measured for a coffin. "Beautiful animal, isn't he?" Gus said, appearing at Caleb's shoulder. 1,200 pounds of breeding stock potential, if anyone could actually get near him. Of course, that would require a man with real courage, not some farm boy playing dress-up. Caleb studied the bull carefully, noting the scars on Iron Thunder's flanks, evidence of electric prods and whips used by previous handlers. The animal's ears were torn, probably from being dragged with ropes. Someone had tried to break this creature through pain and force, turning natural strength into seething rage. "What did they do to him?" Caleb asked quietly. Gus shrugged. "Previous owner tried every trick in the book. Didn't work, obviously. Some animals are just born mean, boy. Born to hurt people." But Caleb saw something else in Iron Thunder's eyes, something the other men had missed because they'd been too busy running or too focused on domination. Beneath the rage, buried under layers of pain and betrayal, was fear. This bull had been hurt so many times that violence had become his only language. "Time's wasting, Rivers," Gus announced loudly. "Sun's getting low, and Iron Thunder gets testier as evening approaches. You making your attempt, or are you ready to sign those papers?" Caleb walked slowly to the gate of Iron Thunder's pen, his boots crunching on gravel as the crowd fell silent. The bull stood motionless in the center, muscles rippling beneath black hide, eyes locked onto the approaching boy with laser intensity. "Last chance to back out, Rivers," Gus called, his voice carrying genuine surprise that the boy had made it this far. But Caleb wasn't listening anymore. His focus was entirely on Iron Thunder, on the pain beneath the rage, on scars that told a story of cruelty and broken trust. This wasn't about proving courage or winning a bet. This was about two broken souls recognizing something in each other. "He's scared," Caleb said quietly, his voice somehow carrying to every person present. "Look at his eyes. He's not angry. He's terrified." Iron Thunder snorted, pawing the ground with one massive hoof. But Caleb noticed something others missed. The bull's ears weren't pinned back in aggression. They were swiveling, listening, processing every sound with the hypervigilance of an animal expecting pain. Slowly, deliberately, Caleb reached for the gate latch. The metallic click echoed like a gunshot. Several women in the crowd covered their eyes, unable to watch what they were certain would be tragedy. The gate swung open. Iron Thunder's head snapped up, nostrils flaring. For a heartbeat that lasted eternity, Bull and Boy stared at each other across 20 feet of dirt and desperation. Then Caleb took his first step into the pen. Thunder's reaction was immediate and terrifying. He lowered his massive head and charged with the force of a freight train. The crowd screamed. Sheriff Bradley drew his weapon, but Caleb didn't run. Instead, he did something no one expected. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, closed his eyes, and began to speak. "I know what they did to you," he said, his voice calm despite thundering hooves bearing down on him. "I know how they hurt you, made you afraid. But I'm not them." Iron Thunder skidded to a halt barely 3 feet away, dust billowing around them both. Every muscle in his enormous body was coiled for violence, but something in Caleb's voice had penetrated the red haze of rage. "They used whips on you, didn't they?" Caleb whispered. "And electric prods. They tried to break your spirit because they couldn't understand your strength." The bull circled him slowly, hooves creating small earthquakes. Caleb could feel Thunder's hot breath, smell the musky scent of his hide. One wrong move and 2,000 pounds of fury would end his life instantly. Iron Thunder stopped circling. His massive head lowered until level with Caleb's, close enough that the boy could see his own reflection in the bull's dark eyes. They stayed frozen in that impossible tableau. Predator and prey, strength and vulnerability, fear and understanding. Then, slowly, carefully, Caleb opened his eyes and raised his right hand. The crowd held its collective breath. Gus Thornfield's face had gone pale, his confident smirk replaced by dawning horror as he realized what was about to happen. Caleb's fingertips made contact with Iron Thunder's forehead, just below the massive horns. The bull's hide was warm, surprisingly soft, trembling with barely contained power. Then, Iron Thunder did something no one would ever forget. The great bull, the demon that had terrorized grown men, lowered his head and leaned into Caleb's touch like a pet seeking comfort. The silence was absolute. Caleb kept his hand on Thunder's forehead, feeling the animal's breathing return to normal, feeling tension drain from muscles coiled for battle. "That's it," Caleb whispered. "That's all you needed. Someone who saw you as more than just a weapon." Iron Thunder rumbled deep in his chest. Not the angry bellow of before, but something softer, more peaceful. He nuzzled Caleb's shoulder with surprising gentleness. Old Murphy found his voice first. "Well, I'll be damned. The boy did it. He actually did it." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Caleb barely heard them. When he finally stood and stepped back, Iron Thunder simply watched with calm, intelligent eyes as the boy who had seen his soul walked toward the gate. Gus Thornfield stood frozen, cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally numb resignation. The impossible had happened. A 16-year-old farm boy had accomplished what 37 grown men could not. "The papers," Caleb said quietly. "I believe you have some papers to sign, Mr. Thornfield." The transfer documents were signed there in the dust and fading sunlight, witnessed by half the county. With each signature, 12,000 acres passed from the hands of a wealthy bully to those of a humble farm boy who had shown more courage in 10 minutes than most men showed in a lifetime. But Caleb's first act as the new owner surprised everyone. "Mr. Thornfield, you can stay in the house as long as you need. And Iron Thunder, he's not for sale, not for breeding, not for anything. He's earned his peace." Sheriff Bradley approached with something approaching awe. "Son, how did you know that Bull wouldn't hurt you?" Caleb looked back at Iron Thunder, now grazing peacefully. "Because he reminded me of myself. Sometimes when you've been hurt enough, you forget how to trust, but that doesn't mean you've forgotten how to love." 6 months later, the ranch had been transformed. Caleb sold half the land to pay for his mother's treatment and establish a fund for struggling farmers. The remaining acres became a sanctuary for rescued animals. Iron Thunder remained the heart of it all, no longer the feared demon of legend, but a gentle giant who allowed children to pet his massive head. When veterinarians came to study his transformation, Caleb always gave the same answer. Love isn't complicated. We just make it that way. In the end, Gus Thornfield's cruelest joke had become the county's greatest gift, the reminder that sometimes the most impossible things require nothing more than an open heart and the willingness to offer kindness to a creature the world had written off as hopeless.